Okay, now we're going to take our first stab at testing the division application. The only way I know to do tests right now is manually, so we're going to start with manual testing. And for the first test, I'm just going to repeat the functionality that we exercised in the last tutorial. I'm going to see if it successfully divides 4 by 5. So we know that 4 divided by 5 is 0.8. So what we expect when we click the Go button is that 0.8 would show up in the result text box. So let's start the test. 0.8 did show up in the result text box. So our application passed this first test. Now, 5 is a greater number than 4, so I want to try what happens if you divide something by a number that's smaller than itself. Make sure that the application passes that test. So we're going to try to divide 6 divided by 3, and I expect 2 to show up in the result text box. So I click Go. 2 does show up in the result text box, so it passed that test. Now let's think about a more interesting test. So for instance, I know that what I learned in school is that if you divide a number by itself, 1 should show up. So let's see if the application successfully does that. We're going to try dividing 7 by 7. We expect 1 to show up in the results text box. 1 did show up in the results text box, so it passed that test. Now what if we divide 0 by 7? We learned in class in school that dividing anything 0 by anything, the result should be 0. So let's see if the application passes that test. The result 0 shows up in the result box, so it passed the test. Now the question is, what if we divide something by 0? And I think things get a little more interesting here, because in math class we all learned that it's impossible to divide something by 0 according to normal rules of arithmetic. So let's see what the application does. I'm not actually sure what the result should be here because I haven't dealt with that in the application. So let's see what happens. So we click 0 and we get a divide by 0 exception. So in other words, our application displayed an error. We're running this in the IDE, but if this had been the compiled application, the user would have gotten an ugly error message here, and then the application would have just stopped. We don't want that. That's one of the reasons we're testing here. So let's go ahead and fix that bug that we just discovered. And all I'm going to do, once I can start coding again, is I'm going to say I'm going to put code in here that says if convert, we're going to take the value of the divide by text box, we're going to convert it to a decimal, pardon me. And we're going to say if that value is 0, let's just tell the user that they can't divide by 0. And let's go ahead and return so that code doesn't in this case fall through to the code that will cause the bug. So now we believe we fixed the bug. Let's run that test. So another way to refer to this test we're about to do is regression testing. We're going to do the test that failed and see that hopefully it passes. So we're going to say 7 divided by 0. We're going to click the Go button, and what we expect is that we're going to get a box saying you cannot divide by 0. Of course, I've discovered a minor bug that it says 0 instead of 0, but that's something we can fix later. So it says you cannot divide by 0, and once you click OK, it stays. It doesn't try to execute that code, and it doesn't encounter that bug. So we have successfully fixed the defect that we found through testing. Okay, now we're going to do test for one final thing in our application. And as we do this test, as we run the test, we're going to see it fail, and we're going to fix it. But as we do that, I also want to introduce the idea of a code-based regressing and of regression testing as a mechanism to guard against a code-based regressing. So the idea behind a code-based regressing is the idea that it's quite often in development that as we continue to code on our code base, we reintroduce bugs that at one time were fixed. This can happen through a variety of ways. We're going to see a way that's a little bit contrived. In a second, we're going to see that way that's a little bit contrived, but it will serve as an example for how this could happen. So the idea behind regression testing is that as you think of and perform tests on your application, you save those tests. Generally for manual tests, they'll be saved in things called a test suite. They'll be saved as test cases. And then periodically at certain times during application development, you will rerun those tests just to be sure that you haven't reintroduced any bugs that used to exist and got fixed, or perhaps you might have broken functionality or introduced a bug into functionality that you've already coded for. So that's the idea behind regression testing. Now we're going to test for our final piece of functionality, and at the same time introduce a regression bug, and then see it get caught with regression testing. Okay, so what we're going to test for is how does the application handle when the user enters a non-numeric value into one or both of the text boxes. So what I've done here is I've entered A into the to divide text box, and I've entered a regular number 7 into the divide by text box. I'm not sure, this is another one of those tests where we're not sure what will happen because I didn't code for it, but we're going to do the test and see what does happen. So I click go, and then we see an error thrown by our application. Now again, we're in the IDE at this point, so we see this kind of text box. If we were in if this were a compiled application, the user would have seen just an error box, and then the application would have stopped working. And obviously we don't want that, so we're going to fix this bug. Now here's the contrived example of regressing. What I'm going to pretend is that instead of introducing a new if clause, that I accidentally wrote over the existing if clause. So that means I would have taken out the guard that tests for 0 being for dividing by 0. So how we're going to fix this is we're going to say if to divide. Actually, we're going to do this. We're going to say this is a little bit of more of .NET or C# code than you might want, but I'm going to describe this as I go along. So really what we're going to do is we're going to try to parse each of the values in the text boxes into an int. If either of them are not successfully parsed into an int, then we're going to tell the user that both values must be numeric. So let's try that now. And hope you'll bear with me as I just do a little bit of code. Okay, so what you can see I've done here is I've introduced two variables, both of them ints. One is is to hold the result, what's in the to divide text box. One is to hold what's in the divide by text box, and I have now done a try parse to try to parse what's in the text box to an int. If that parsing doesn't succeed, then I show a message box back to the user, and I had forgotten to do a return in there so that we don't execute, in this case, the code that would cause the bug. So I show a message box back to the user. I do that for the to divide text box and the divide by text box. If both of those have succeeded, then I take the results of parsing those values into ints, and I divide those and display the result. And I've got something. Okay, and so now that's how that should work. So now let's just run that test again and be sure that it actually does work. As soon as Okay, so we're going to put the letter A in the first text box and the number 7 in the second text box. And what we expect when we click go is that we get a message box telling us that both values must be whole numbers. That is what we got, so it passed that test. Now we're just going to make sure that run our test with the letter in the divide by text box to make sure it passes that test. Okay, so we expected a message box telling us both values must be a whole number. That's what we got, so it passed that test. Okay, so now I'd like to revisit and expand on something we touched on just a second ago, and that's test cases and regression testing. So what you see here is I've documented my tests in a test suite, which is a set of test cases. I've done it in Excel. It conforms pretty much to some stuff that's kind of standard in manual testing. So what you'll see from my test suite is, I've got a column that is the test case names. Each row, by the way, is one of the test cases. So I've got the test case name, I've got the steps in that test, and I've got the expected result. Now let's look at the test runs. So a test run is just the documentation of the result of running through a test case one time. So in our test cases, I've got the test case name, the steps, and the expected results. These all come from the test suite itself, and we should have each test in the test suite in our test run. So then as the tester runs through the test cases, they will document the actual results and whether or not the test passed, or whether or not, I should say, the application passed that test. So what you see in test run 1 is the documentation of the steps that we went through, even though we weren't recording the actual results and whether or not it passed. At that point, you're seeing it as if we had done that. So you see that as we went through these, 4 of the tests passed, 3 of them, or the application passed 4 of the tests, the application failed 3 of the tests. And just to refresh your memory, we ran the test for it to divide by 0. We saw the application fail. We fixed that bug. We ran it again, and we saw the application pass that test. Then we ran the 2 tests for when a user enters non-numeric values in the text box. We saw in each case that they failed. We fixed those bugs. We ran, and we saw that those tests passed. Now later you'll see how when we ran those, we were running down in we were starting the beginning of our second test run. But we'll talk about that in a second. The important thing here is to remember that when we fix these 2, we also, because this is a demonstration, we know that we quote-unquote accidentally reintroduced our divide by 0 bug. So now we're going to look at test run 2, and what you'll see in test run 2, and actually I need to continue to get this back to a state where as if it would have looked in the real world. So in test run 2, we've already exercised 2 of these tests. Those are the tests having to do with when the user enters a non-numeric value in either of the text boxes. And we know those tests have passed. Now I want to start at the beginning of the test the test cases, and run them and complete our full test run 2 for regression testing. So I'm going to start the first one. I'm going to enter 4 into the first text box and 5 into the second text box. What we expect is that 0.8 will show up in the result text box. I click go. 0.8 does show up in the text box, so we're just going to say that, let it know that the actual result matched the expected result, and the application passed that test case. Now we're going to go on to the second test case. We're going to enter 6 into the first text box, 3 into the second. When we click go, we expect the result text box to display 2. We click go, the result text box displays 2, so I'm going to record the fact that the actual result was the same as the expected result, and that the application passed that test. Now we're going to go into the third test. We're going to test that it can successfully divide a number by itself. We're going to enter 7 in the first text box, 7 in the second text box. When we click go, we expect the result text box to display 1. So we'll enter 7 here. We'll click go. The results text box displayed 1. So we're going to record the fact that the actual result was the same as the expected result, and that the application passed that test. We're going to go on to the next test now, where we just try to divide a 0 by a number. So we want to enter 0 in the first text box, 7 in the second. Let's go ahead and do that. And when we click go, we expect the results text box to display 0. So we click go, the results text box displays 0, so we want to record the fact that the actual result was the same as the expected result, and the application did pass that test. Now we're at the test that we happen to know that we've introduced a bug here. So let's see what happens when we exercise this test. So we're going to enter 7 in the first text box, 0 in the second text box, and we're going to click go. And what we expect is that the user will have a message telling them they can't divide by 0. Let's see what actually happens. So since this is a demonstration, we know that what actually happened is the user there is a divide by 0 exception. If this were a compiled application, the user would have gotten the ugly error box and the application would have just stopped working. So we want to fix that. So now I'm going to talk just a second about a couple of ways that we could fix it, and what each might mean, and how regression testing could help us here also. Rather than demonstrate all this, I'm just going to talk about it. So one way I could have fixed this was to reintroduce that if clause. That's the same clause I had before I did the guard clauses for if the user entered a non-numeric value. But one thing to think about that, if I did that, essentially what I'd say is convert what they entered in the divide by text box to a decimal, and if it equals 0, tell them that they can't divide by 0. Now a lot of you might already see the problem with that, and that is something we discovered later, which is that when we're converting to a decimal, we're assuming that they entered in that text box something that can be converted to a decimal. This is the exact bug that we fixed here. So if they entered an A into the text box, the divide by 0 test would fail. Or in fact, any test would fail if they entered an A. This test would fail if they entered an A into that, because it would first hit this and would encounter the bug. Or really, I'm thinking it out as I talk. If they entered an A in the second text box, the test for non-numeric values would fail, because before it got to that guard clause, the code would try to convert that value to a decimal and would hit that bug. So really, so the point I'm trying to make here is, if we had fixed this and run our regression testing, we would have seen the test for when they entered a non-numeric value in the second text box. We would have seen that failed and realized that we had regressed our code even as we tried to fix one bug. So we would have come back, realized what had happened, removed that code, and put code down here that does this. So really what's happening here is we have the guard clauses that handle anything being a non-numeric value. So by the time we get to here, we know that what was in the divide by text box was not non-numeric and has already been parsed into an int. So now we can just check that if that int is 0, and then we can show the message box to the user. So now we're going to go ahead and run that test in the test case. It failed the first time. We're going to run it again. So we're going to enter 7 in the first text box, 0 in the second. That's this here. We click go. We expect there to be a message box telling the user that they can't divide by 0, and we expect not to have a bug. So let's see what actually happens. We see the message box. We have no bug. So the application passed that test again. So we're going to record the fact that the actual result is the same as the expected result, and that the application passed that test. Now, what you'll see here is that in the way we were exercising our test cases, this test run 2, the application has now passed test run 2. What I want to talk about now is that we haven't actually been doing things exactly like they would be done in the real world. In the real world, they would have run through all the test cases in the test suite, recorded the results, and then there would have been an effort to fix all the bugs or failed tests found in that test run. So now we're going to just quickly make another test run and actually do a clean walkthrough of our application and hopefully see it pass all the tests in our test case. So we're going to run the first test case. We're going to enter 4 in the first text box, 5 in the second. When we click go, we expect to see 0.8 show up. We do see it show up. I'm going to run through these quickly. We're going to enter 6 in the first text box, 3 in the second. We're going to click go and expect to see 2 show up. It did show up. We're going to enter 7 in the first text box. We're going to enter 7 in the second. We're going to click go. We're going to see that it did show up. We're going to expect to see a 1, and we're going to see that a 1 showed up. We're going to enter 0 in the first text box, 7 in the second text box. We're going to expect a 0 in the results, and we're going to see that 0 is what we got. We're going to enter A in the first text box, 7 in the second text box. We expect there to be a, you know what, I skipped the divide by 0 test. We'll do that in 1 second. So we've entered A, we've entered 7. We expect there to be a message box saying they have to be whole numbers. We got the message box, so it passed. Now let's go back to the divide by 0 test. We're going to enter 7 in the first text box, 0 in the second text box. We expect to see a message telling us we can't divide by 0. We see that message, so we passed that test, or the application passed that test. Now, just to reorient us, since I skipped ahead, we're going to do the final test that it handles there being a non-numeric value in the second text box. So we're going to enter 7 in the first text box, A in the second text box. When we click go, we expect to see a message box telling us we can't, that both must be a whole number. We see that, so the application passed that test. Now I'm just going to quickly document for each of these tests the fact that the actual result was the same as the expected result, and the fact that the application passed that test. So now we can see test run 3, where in each case the application passed the test, so we've got a clean run of the test. So now we've covered the idea of manual regression testing and what test cases are.